Earlier, when you were talking about, the telescope and the ability to go back in time, how can you determine the time of a second with a telescope? How does that work?
Okay, how does that work? Well, at radio telescopes, we're able to actually look so far back in the universe. And here's the principle. The farther away you look, the farther back in time you're seeing. So when we look at the Andromeda Galaxy, it's 2.5 million light years away. If you look at it tonight, you're seeing it as it was 2.5 million years ago. But the radiation left over from the cosmic creation event takes you back to when the universe was only 380,000 years old. And when we look at the polarization of that microwave background radiation, it shows us the state of the universe when it was 100 billionth of a trillionth of a trillionth of a second old. And you say, how do you know that? Because the polarization signal explains to you that moment when the universe hyperinflated, which is consistent with that time when we have the strong nuclear force separating out from the electroweak force. And we know that the universe has to be a particular temperature for that to happen, and that temperature coincides when the universe is 10 to the minus 35 seconds old. Now, if you want a little more detail, a little more understandable for lay people, I got all that in The Crater in the Cosmos.
No, that's what I was thinking too, the way you answered. That's kind of what I was expecting, so.
All right.
We'll go right down here.
Hi there. I've been considering your proposal about gaps in the genealogies in the Bible. I'm trying to wrap my head around that, and I did some studying last night and this morning, and I'm seeing in Genesis 5 and Genesis 10, they're talking not merely about so-and-so begat so-and-so, and you talked about how that could mean not just being the father of, but they're also saying that begat so-and-so at such and such an age. So it seems that those places, there aren't room for gaps, and it seems other places where we're talking about interactions between the Father and the Son. So I'm not sure where those gaps would be, if possible. And I was also wondering along that line, are there others who, other than you, who believe in a genealogy that's shorter in time, and that maybe there was an event that caused the chromosomal acceleration of the observed change in mitochondrial DNA, et cetera, that gives the timeline of 50,000 years?
Okay. What Fuzz was saying in response to that question yesterday is that when you read it in the English translation, it looks like there are no gaps. But, English has a very large vocabulary compared to biblical Hebrew. When you read it in the original Hebrew, it's quite clear there's rooms for gaps. The question is how many gaps? And incidentally, when you go through the Old Testament, every genealogy has gaps in it. And Fuzz was making the point that what the people recording the genealogies are doing is putting down the names to make a theological point. And the point that I think is being made in Genesis 5 and Genesis 11, it's recording the patriarchs who died a natural death. And when we look at what the Bible says about the flood of Noah and what was happening the days before the flood of Noah, you'll see this in a chapter in Navigating Genesis. It's at the book table there, that at a minimum, 95% of human beings in the days before the flood were having their lives ended by being murdered by their fellow man. The murder rate was just way off. In fact, God had to intervene with the flood to prevent humanity from self-extermination. That's how high the murder rate was. And so the exceptions were these patriarchs that actually died a natural death, or in the case of Enoch, was taken by God up to heaven. The other thing you notice is when you go through the biblical genealogies, it likes numbers, even numbers. So you see in Genesis 5, 10 names. Genesis 11, 10 names. If you go to Luke 3, it throws an 11th name for the genealogy from Adam down to Noah. And so that by itself tells you there's got to be at least one gap in the genealogy. But for me, the evidence of just how much gapping you got is when you read Genesis chapter 2, it talks about these 4 named rivers coming together in the Garden of Eden. And it tells you where they flow from. So it's easy to identify those 4 rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates still flow today. The Gihon and the Pishon stopped flowing when the ice left over from the last ice age melted away, but we can still see the dry riverbeds to this various day. And in Navigating Genesis, I show you a satellite image that shows you the 4 rivers and where they would have come together. They only come together in what is now the southeastern portion of the Persian Gulf. Today, it's 250 feet below sea level. But during the last ice age, it would have been 80 feet above sea level. Now, that gives us a rough date for when God created Adam and Eve. Tells us that it was sometime during the last ice age. And you say, well, what kind of date is that? Well, it's somewhere between 15,000 and 120,000 years ago. Incidentally, that's more accurate than our best scientific date for the origin of humanity. Fuzz was talking about mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome DNA. That date establishes that the origin of humanity was 150,000 years ago, plus or minus 150,000 years. So the Bible actually gives us a more accurate date for the origin of humanity than the scientific evidence. But that tells us roughly how much of a gapping there must have been in Genesis 5 and Genesis 11. The other way we can get a handle on it is that people were living longer in the days before Noah. And astronomers have actually identified a supernova eruption event that greatly increased the cosmic ray exposure that we human beings have, and they got a rough date for that. The date puts us in the last ice age, probably somewhere between 40 to 100,000 years ago. So that again helps us narrow down the date a little bit. But there again, it gives us an idea of just how much gapping there had to be between Adam and Abraham. Not a factor of 1 million, but probably somewhere between a factor of 10 and a factor of 100, somewhere within that range. And the details you'll see in Navigating Genesis. And your question, how many scholars agree that there's these gaps? Almost all of them do. In fact, I don't know of any doctoral level theologian that wouldn't agree that there's got to be gaps in that genealogy.
Good morning. You mentioned the expanding universe and the ability to get to within 10 to the negative 35 from when it was created. So I guess my question is, does that support or contradict a Big Bang type theory?
No, it strongly supports it because one of the key components of the Big Bang creation model is that there's this inflation event that happens when the universe is 10 to the minus 35 seconds old. And the inflation has to be incredibly fine-tuned in order to make possible the existence of life after the inflation event. So you'll see a whole chapter on the inflation event in the Creator and the cosmos and why this is good news for the Christian faith.
I got one here. Of all of your books out there that you brought, what would you say would be the best one to share with a non-believer?
The best one to share with a non-believer, if they're educated in the sciences, I'd probably say the Creator and the cosmos. Otherwise, I'd say why the universe is the way it is, especially if they're hung up on the problem of evil. I would give them why the universe is the way it is. If they got problems with the Bible, I'd say Navigating Genesis. And my whole point is, talk to your non-Christian friend, find out what their issue is, then pick the right resource for them. They will appreciate that, rather than just giving them something generic.
You talked about free will and the debate within the Christian community, and now it's also a debate within the atheist community, and it's a similar but separate debate. Sam Harris admits the reason he don't want there to be free will is because that is the theist excuse for why there is pain and suffering. But then, of course, he and Daniel Dennett have a different debate. So what's the difference between the debate within the Christian community, the debate within the atheist community, and the debate between Christians and atheists, and what do you say to the atheists?
Well, it's interesting because atheists are divided on this just like Christians are, in the sense that you've got some atheists who are denying that there's any free will at all. You know, everything's predetermined. And then there's others that totally deny that there's any kind of predetermination going on. It's nothing but free will. Rather similar to what's going on in the Christian community. You've got communities that say it's 100% free will and no predestination, and then 100% predestination and no free will. So it also happens in the community of non-believers, the same kind of debate. But what really gets us down to why it's got to be Christian when you realize it's both. And so how I would reach out to the Sam Harrises of the world is with that approach. It's not either or, it's both. And if it's both, then the Christian message must be true. And so giving them the physical evidence that indeed it must be both. I mean, there's events that take place in history that are very difficult to explain if there's not some kind of predetermination going on. But likewise, there are events that are very difficult to explain if there isn't free will. And I give some insights into that and why the universe is the way it is. How, for example, the behavior of Adolf Hitler makes no sense if it's 100% free will. Something is going on. And keep in mind, in the Christian perspective, it's not just God that's trying to intervene and change the way we operate. Satan is there as well. So it's a little more complex than what I was sharing this morning, which is why I kind of break that down into 3 chapters in Beyond the Cosmos.
Last night, the talk went on to about the irreducible complexity and that whole line of argument of science, we made this observation and we can't explain it, therefore God must have done it. Only to wait 1 to 10 years and then, oh look, we can explain it now, so you look like a fool, right? Do you think the creation of the universe is either the only example where you can say, I can't explain this, therefore it's a miracle, God did it, or do you still think that it's more an argument from necessity, where this is the logical conclusion, not, I can't explain it, so God did it? Like, what do you think about?
Yeah, just to be careful, we're not saying the irreducible complexity argument is a totally bad argument. What we're saying is most Christians do not present it in a sophisticated enough way that has any impact on the engineering and scientific community. And so Fuzz, for example, has written a number of articles on how to present the irreducible complexity argument in a way that is going to be effective. So the problem is we Christians tend to oversimplify and overstate our evidences, and then we lose credibility and we do that. But we would argue that probably the easiest way for lay people to engage STEM folks on this issue is through a comparison. Okay, here's the non-theistic model, here's the Christian model, and for that matter, you can throw in a Buddhist model if you want, or any other number of models, and say, okay, of all those different models, which one is having the greatest predictive success in terms of future scientific discoveries? Which one is most consistent? Which one has the fewest problems or issues that would be considered possibly intractable? And so we're basically talking about gaps. And you may have heard non-theists say this, you Christians are just arguing the God of the gaps. Well, the way we do it is to say, no, there are gaps everywhere. None of us have complete knowledge. There's always gaps in our knowledge and understanding. However, we can use these gaps to put all these different models to the test. Do the gaps from a non-theistic perspective get bigger or smaller as we learn more and more? Do they get less numerous or more numerous as we learn more and more? And you heard us address the origin of life. With the origin of life, the non-theistic gaps are getting bigger at a very rapid rate and more numerous and more intractable. In fact, every time we go to an origin of life research conference, we notice the participants there are more depressed than they were at the previous meeting because of how the problems have gotten bigger, more intractable, and more numerous. But from a Christian perspective in the origin of life, the gaps have gotten dramatically smaller, less numerous. And so by comparing those two, and it's kind of like what William Paley did, you get an easy to present and yet very powerful demonstration that the biblical worldview is really on the pathway to truth. Now, it doesn't give you absolute proof of the Christian worldview, but shows you that the probability is very high and gets higher with every week that goes by. You know, as I was mentioning in my talk on Friday, when it talks about the fine-tuning of our galaxy and solar system, the evidence gets about a factor of 1,000 times stronger with every month that goes by. And so, since we live in the 21st century, where the advance of science is so rapid, we can come up with dramatically greater evidence in literally just the passage of days. We don't have to wait years. And so in more than a theory, we actually have a list of predictions of what we think will happen in the next 10 years. And so we challenge atheists by saying, hey, just watch what happens and see if our predictions come true, and see what happens to your predictions, and let the best model win.
Okay, 1 minute answer right here, Hugh, and then we'll end it. Earlier in the Big Bang event that you said, yes, that scientific evidence affirms that. What would be your definition of the Big Bang then?
The definition of the Big Bang is the universe coming into existence with matter, energy, space, and time, where the expansion of the universe from the cosmic creation event is the most exquisitely fine-tuned thing we can measure in all of science. It's not an explosion. It's an incredibly fine-tuned expansion event from the beginning of the universe. And there's nothing more fine-tuned, more spectacularly fine-tuned than the Big Bang. And because of the Big Bang, physical life can exist in the universe. It's the only model of the universe that permits the existence of physical life. And God did it.